Welcome to this session on identities. This is the first module where we focus on Azure Active Directory. Let's go and take a step back where we'll talk about Active Directory and then how it connects to Azure Active Directory. So let's draw some pictures and try to understand this better. On your premise, you always had certain domain controllers. A domain controller is a server where you will go ahead and create users, groups, organization units, group policies, etc. Now, you also had certain applications on premise. Think about timesheets applications, right? Where you used to go ahead and fill up timesheets, or maybe HR-based applications as well. Now, in today's modern world, we have all of these applications going to the cloud. Think about Office 365, or think about Workday, right? How about Concur, which is a famous travel application? Now we've got all of these applications in the cloud. These are all considered as SaaS-based applications, right? Now, since we have these apps in the cloud, we also want these identities in the cloud to have a better form of authentication and authorization. So that's where Azure Active Directory comes into picture. Now we will have users, groups created in Azure Active Directory, and then you can allow them to access these applications. Or you can have the existing set of identities, let's call them as user 1, user 2, or rather give them real names, let's say Joe or Mark, right? You want these users to log into cloud-based applications, then you need to have some kind of a synchronization method for these guys to access their applications. And this synchronization is done with the help of a connector called as AZ Connect. This connector runs on your premise on one of the member servers, and it will synchronize your on-premise identities to Azure Active Directory. And this will assist your users now in the cloud. Let's call them as, again, Joe and Mark, because these users, Joe and Mark, got synchronized to Azure AD. They can then log into your cloud-based applications. Today, it's very important and paramount to have your identities in the cloud, and that is primarily for not just for accessing applications, but to have a better control on security. So your Azure Active Directory will be circling around several other parameters. So think about conditional access, multi-factor authentication, role-based access controls. Well, these are all embedded and integrated into Azure Active Directory. So with all these identities in the cloud, you can have a better focus on role-based access controls as well as on the security. This module is all about how you can provision the users in the cloud and allow them access to those applications. Let's get started. In this lesson, let's go ahead and learn about the various benefits, features, and advantages of Azure Active Directory. Okay, so by now we know that Azure Active Directory is fundamentally a cloud-based directory services, right? That means that you provision all your identities in cloud, in Azure in this case. In the previous lesson, we did understand that in today's world we got cloud-based applications. You think about Salesforce and even Office 365 and several other list of applications that we can have in this list here. So it means that Azure Active Directory is great for organizations that would like to onboard cloud-based applications. Well, that does not mean that it is not good for on-premise applications. So if you have on-premise applications on your data center, You can use something like an application proxy to connect your on-premise applications to Azure identities. So that ways your on-premise applications can also get the benefit of the SAML, single sign-on authentication, and all the security features that Azure Active Directory provides. You can use Azure Active Directory with a multitude of devices. It could be your iPad, it could be your PDA devices, Mac OS, and of course Windows operating systems. With the unique identity protection benefits that Azure Active Directory offers, you will be able to know any suspicious sign-ins, any vulnerabilities in the authentication flow. You can get advanced security reports, remediate if there are any issues found in the identification flow, and thereby you will protect your business from any potential risks. Since there are several self-service capabilities in Azure Active Directory, you will be able to reduce the costs of securing the identities and securing the authentication flow. So if you're using Office 365, Salesforce, Dynamic CRM for that matter, it means that you're already using and taking the advantages, the benefits that Azure Active Directory offers. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the differences between on-premise Active Directory services, also called as ADDS, versus what Azure Active Directory got to offer. Azure Active Directory is also called as AAD, and ADDS represents your on-premise directory services solutions. So let's go ahead and write that here. ADDS is your on-premise directory services. So on your premise, you would be able to create users, computers, group policies, run federation as well with the help of Active Directory federation services. What if you would like to have certificate services? You would go ahead and deploy, let's say, ADCS. You can also have Active Directory rights management to protect your intellectual property. Well, all of that was very well integrated into on-premise Active Directory services, right? All your client machines like Windows 7 or Windows 10 and older clients like Windows XP as well used to get authenticated with the help of a protocol called as Kerberos, which is running on port number 88 UDP, right? How about LDAP connections? All the LDAP connections and connectivities used to happen on port number 389. That all stands good when the applications were on-premise, but now the identities and the building of modern applications is all going to the cloud, and we call them as SaaS applications. Think about Office 365, Concur, travel applications, HR applications like Workday, they're all in the cloud, right? So we're no longer using Kerberos for authentication, instead using SAML, Secure Assertion Markup Language, which will let you do the authentication securely with the help of exchanging claims and tokens. If your application is not SAML compatible, then you can go for OpenID or OAuth. The auth here does not represent authentication, it represents authorization. So OpenID is for authentication and OAuth is for authorization. These are the main concepts here. Keep in mind that Azure Active Directory is a hierarchical tree structure. You can create users and group inside an organization unit. Azure Active Directory is a flat structure. So you do not have any organization unit structure. You cannot create group policies as well. But what you can do is you can join the Windows devices to Azure Active Directory with the help of a feature called as domain join. We'll talk about that in the next lessons, but we have the Windows domain join feature, where you can join your on-premise devices to Azure Active Directory using the Windows Domain Join feature. Azure Active Directory is very much compatible with all REST APIs. So if you are building your own applications and would like to have authentication done through a cloud-based directory, then it supports REST APIs securely. Traditionally, you always had to go ahead and provision Active Directory federation services. But with Azure Active Directory, you really do not have to do that because federation is part of Azure Active Directory. It is inbuilt. So you do not have to install it. Any applications that you would like to onboard to your users as part of single sign-on activities is something that you can do Azure Active Directory seamlessly. There is no installation of Active Directory Federation services required here. Azure Active Directory is a managed service from Microsoft. It is pretty much secure, and with the help of P1 edition, you will be able to get Identity Protection Suite as well. That means that you get better protection for your identities. Just to summarize, traditionally, we always used to create a virtual machine or a physical machine to host that Active Directory domain services. But here, when we come to cloud-based infrastructure, as soon as you create a subscription in Azure, you have the directory services with you. You have a tenant where you can start utilizing the features of Azure Active Directory as soon as you create a subscription in Azure.
In this lab exercise, we will navigate to Azure Active Directory and understand the various options we have in there. To do so, let's go ahead and log into the portal and then click on Azure Active Directory. If you do not find it in your favorites, you can either go ahead and type Azure Active Directory in this search box here, or you will find Azure Active Directory in this blade. I'll click on Azure AD and then make some space for myself by clicking on this little arrow, and then I've got a larger screen to work with. So right now, my directory name is as good as my email address. So this is my email address without any special characters. So if I move my mouse and hover it over my sign in here, I would see my name, my email address, and then the directory. If you try to compare the email and directory, you will notice that it's just the same, except that it does not have any special characters. So if you have any dots, underscores, hyphens in your email address, they will be removed and it will be kept as a single string, and that string will be your directory. Your domain name will be your directory.onmicrosoft.com, as you see in the pop-up there. Okay, so remember that your directory is your email address without any special characters. Of course, the .com or .net will be removed, and the domain name will be your directory.onmicrosoft.com. So that was about the default directory. Okay, so when you create an account for yourself in Azure, could be a free account or pay as you go, or if you're an enterprise, you create an enterprise account, doesn't matter. You will get a default directory with this standard naming convention. Okay, so when you create users in this Azure Active Directory, the username will be, let's say, Mark at the domain name as shown here. So it will be Mark at keeplearningcloud.hotmail.onmicrosoft.com. That's how it's going to be. Let me show that to you. So if I navigate to the user section, and then I'm going to pick up just any random user, let's say Alex. What's his email address? His email address is alex at the domain name that you saw in this pop-up. Okay, but this really doesn't make sense. What if an organization wants to have their own custom domain? Let's say they have registered a domain called as www.myproducts.com. Maybe you're selling some fancy products on your e-commerce website, so you purchase the domain. So all your employees should have an email address which is custom and specific to you. For example, alex at myproducts.com. How do you do that? Well, what you can do is go back to your default directory, scroll down to the point where you see custom domain names, and then here you have to register your own domain. Okay, so what I did for demonstration purposes is that I purchased a domain called as rainingcloud.de and then added a custom domain. So if you are purchasing a custom domain, let's say www.myproducts.com, you're going to type that here and then add domain. But you're not done yet. You gotta go to your registrar, or the place where you have purchased the website from. Where you can purchase a website from, let's say GoDaddy is a famous registrar and famous provider for domain names, but there are a lot of others like HostGator, BigRock, lots of them are there that's going to give you a custom domain like that. And at the same time, they'll also give you a place to create your own DNS records. So you got to go and log into your registrar and create a TXT record or an MX record, either of them. And once you're done, you got to go and click on verify. Remember that it takes about 24 hours for these DNS records to get propagated and takes time. So once you have created a record, give it some time for it to settle down. And then maybe the following day or after like 12 or 15 hours, click on verify. And then you should be able to see a green checkbox here. That's what I did. So after registering rainingcloud.de, I added these DNS records in the DNS of my registrar. And after verification, I got a checkbox like this. All right. At this point, I will not be able to verify this because I do not own myproducts.com. But if you have your own custom domain name, where you can go ahead and register these DNS records like these, okay? Till that point, you will see the status as unverified. What does that mean? It means that any domain name that is verified like this, I would be able to use it and create user accounts with this DNS suffix. For example, mark at rainingcloud.de. I can of course create alex at keeplearningcloud@hotmail.com, but this really doesn't look good on my visiting card, isn't it? This one looks good, looks more professional because this is a custom domain and looks more genuine, right? Okay, so I will be able to create alex at rainingcloud.de. Let me show that to you. So I'll scroll up to the top, click on users, and then click on new user. Okay, now I've got two options, create user and invite user. Let's go through this first option and I will explain the invite user option later on. Okay, what this means, what is B2B functionality, what is B2C functionality. We'll talk about that later on, but at this time let's just go ahead and focus on creating a user account in your domain, in your custom domain. All right, so I'm going to type, let's say, alex at, well, you have keeplearninghotmail.com, and that's the default one. But if I click on this drop down menu, I will be able to see my verified domain, which is rainingcloud.de. If you notice, I do not have myproducts.com here, right? I do not have that. That's because I do not own it and I have not verified it, right? So I'm going to select that, and there you go. So alex at rainingcloud.de, I can go ahead and type Alex name, type the first name as Alex. I'll leave the last name and then we move on to the password section. Got two options. You can let it automatically generate for you or let you create a password for yourself, right? So I'll put my own password there. Make sure that it is strong enough. You have the options to add this user to the group, right? So if you have role-based access controls to a particular application, you can go ahead and start assigning this user to a particular group, okay? But for now, I'll just ignore this because we haven't worked on the group concept yet, so we'll talk about it later. The next option is, do you want to block the sign-in for this user? You got options for yes or no. But you may be thinking, hey, I'm creating a user, but why do I need to block his sign-in? Well, this is because you may be staging a user. Staging means that you're creating a user even before the user joins the company. Let's say user will be joining in about 7 days and you are creating this account ahead of time. So when the user actually joins the company, you would then enable it instead of creating it on the day when the user joins. That saves a lot of time. So if the user is joining in about 7 days or 20 days or whatever, I will just block his sign in so nobody can take advantage of this user ID and password. Okay, so I'll leave it to no and let Alex log in. You can specify a usage location as well. So if Alex is joining in, let's say, North America, right? So I can just type and select United States. That way, Alex will not be allowed to log in from any other location. Why is this important? Well, this is important because credentials get compromised, isn't it? Even though an organization may have state-of-the-art security, the credentials are getting compromised because of users' negligence sometimes. User clicks on the spam email and there are a couple of hyperlinks and web pages links inside an email. As soon as the user clicks on that spam mail, the credentials may get compromised, and then the authentication attempts will then start to happen from a different location because the credentials have been compromised and the hacker is in a different geographical region, right? So in order to prevent such kind of authentications or not genuine authentications, we will bind the user's authentication to a particular geographic location. We are just trying to add a layer of defense here in the security, but even after binding it, it really does not mean that we are completely securing the user authentication. As they say, security is never done and it is a constant improvement. All right, that's a different topic. We'll talk about that. But moving on to other two fields, there's job title and department, which are self-explanatory. I will not type anything here, but click on create. All right, this user is created. So I've got Alex at this domain, which is the default domain. It was already there, but then there should be another Alex. So what I'm going to do is just use this search field and hit Alex, and I got two of them. And the second one is what we created a minute ago, isn't it? So we can pass on the credentials to Alex and he can start using them. So what will happen if the user logs in, and how will the user log in? What I'm going to do is launch incognito mode. I could have done Control Shift N on the keyboard because I'm using a Chrome browser. That's fine. So I'll do that and then navigate to myapps.microsoft.com. This is where Alex can log in with his set of credentials, and all the applications that have been published to him would be visible on the landing page. Let me show that to you how it looks like. So let's log in with Alex at rainingcloud.de. All right, so now Alex is logging in with the corporate credentials. Hitting next, and Alex knows his password because the password is given by the administrator. Do you see something different? If you look at the background, I've added a big smiley in the background, right? How did that happen? Well, I've added a smiley, but it could be anything. It could be your corporate wallpaper that is representing your own branding and image of the company, right? So if rainingcloud.de has its own branding, its own wallpaper and a logo, that can be displayed in the background. Okay, I'll show you how that looks like in a minute. As soon as we are done with this particular topic, let Alex log in. What do you think must happen now? Alex must be prompted to change the password, isn't it? Well, looks like I didn't type the password correctly, but let's see. There you go. So Alex is now prompted to change his password because Alex is logging in for the first time, isn't it? So there are two people who knows the Alex password, right? Which is not good. One is the admin himself and Alex. So I will type the current password and give a new password as well. Okay, and then sign in. Oh, I'm in a hurry. Fat fingers. Okay, it still says the password does not match, but this should have given you an opportunity to see some other text here. Happy. So this is a branding text as well. So you can write something like no unauthorized access to raining cloud systems or something like that, right? So this is a banner text that can be written under the branding section. So let me quickly change these passwords so that we can see the landing page. All right, the password is changed and now Alex is being redirected to the landing page. Okay, so if Alex would like to access his applications, this is where he needs to go. Right now, there are no applications assigned to Alex, and we'll see how those applications can be assigned to users via groups, etc. So the objective here is to tell you that user accounts can be created on the fly. You can go ahead and create your own custom domains and let it get verified. And it's very easy to achieve that single sign-on experience without losing the security benefits that Azure Active Directory offers. In the next lab, let's take a look at few more features of Azure AD, including self-service password reset, multi-factor authentication, creating and managing groups, and some playing around with PowerShell to create users as well. Hopefully this has been informative to you. Thank you. All right, let's play with PowerShell for some time and understand how you can interact with Azure Active Directory with PowerShell. You can create users look at the users, not just with the user interface or the portal, but also with PowerShell, okay? So I've already launched PowerShell on my computer. So the way to launch PowerShell on your device is to just click on the start button and then start typing in PowerShell like that, and it will automatically show up PowerShell ISE in this pop-up. So you can either select this Windows PowerShell, which is more like a command line interface, but I always prefer using the interactive editor because it has a lot more features than the regular Windows PowerShell command line has to offer. So launch the PowerShell ISE so that way you can edit and write your own comments on the PowerShell, okay? So the first thing that you have to do is to make sure that you got Azure Active Directory modules installed on your computer. If not, you got to install it. The way you would install it is by just typing install hyphen module, and that's simple. And the module that you want to install is called as Azure AD, okay? So I'm going to run this. If it is not installed on your computer, it's going to take a minute, connect to the internet, and then get those modules installed on your device, all right? Now I got this message, or rather say error message, which says that you got to have administrative rights to install this module. So what I'm going to do is open PowerShell one more time, but this time I will right click and run as administrator, okay? All right, so this thing is ready for me, and I'm going to run the same command, which is install my module, install hyphen module, and the name of the module is Azure AD, right? It says not case sensitive, okay? You can just go ahead and make these upper cases just for aesthetics purposes so that it looks good, but for PowerShell, it really doesn't care because it's not case sensitive. Okay, I'll stop my talking now and hit this play button to see what it does. So you got a pop-up here. I'm gonna say yes to all for this one because it's gonna do some modifications to my modules and the functions repository inside it. So say yes to all and give it some time for it to settle down. We got a message that I've got the version 2 of Azure AD already installed, but there is a new version available which is called as 2.76. Okay, so if I want to install this new module or new version, I need to run install hyphen module again, but with a hyphen force syntax. So let's do that. I'll just append hyphen force to this, run it one more time. If you're new to PowerShell, then don't worry because as you have already noticed that it gives you the solutions right there. So if you're getting some error messages or problems, it tells you right there how to solve it, right? So you do not even have to search in the internet and find a solution for yourself. Most of the error messages in PowerShell have the answer right here. So make it a habit to read these warnings, read the error messages, and it will be really helpful for you in the long run. Okay, so now that the Azure AD module is installed, let's go ahead and verify. So what I'm going to do is get hyphen module and then type Azure AD. Now I can highlight all of that and hit this button. I do not have to highlight it. I can just put my mouse right next to the line 3 and hit that one. Do not hit this play button because if you hit this, all the lines all the way from 1, 2, 3, all of them will get executed. But if I hit this one, the smaller play button, it will execute just the line where the cursor is blinking. Okay, so I did not get any output here, that's fine. Next is to connect to my Azure Active Directory by using connect hyphen Azure AD. That's what I'm going to run. Again, just like what we did before, I'm going to hit this so that I get connected to my Azure Active Directory. Here, I got a login as a global administrator. Now, what is a global administrator account? I will navigate to the Azure portal and show that to you. So here is my Azure portal, okay? And then navigate to my main directory page and then under roles and administrators, all right? And then in the search box, I go ahead and type global. I got something called as global administrator. So anybody who is an administrator of Azure Active Directory will be assigned this role. So global administrators have full powers, full rights on Azure Active Directory. Okay. So for you to connect to Azure AD using APIs or PowerShell or CLI, you got to have permissions on Azure AD. And then being part of the global administrator role gives you full rights. Okay. So I'm going to log in as this ID, but keep in mind that you can add further users. For example, in the previous lab, we added a user called as Alex. I'm going to make him a global admin. Just say Alex and then select the user account and then add. That's how we add users to a role. So now what you can do, now Alex can use his set of credentials to manage, delete, remove the contents in Azure AD. Okay, let's see how that can work. Okay, so in this interface, I'll type Alex credentials, which is alex at rainingcloud.de. Okay, and then click on next. You know what the credentials are. There you go. Now I'm connected to Azure Active Directory with Alex credentials. Alex was able to log in because he's a global administrator. Now with this set of credentials, we can go ahead and create users, delete users, in short, manage users. So I'm going to get rid of all of this, start with a blank slate again, and then use this command called as get hyphen Azure AD user. I would like to get all the users in Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to run that. And there you go. I've got all of these users in Azure Active Directory. So I've got them on my interface as an output. Okay. You can then use your PowerShell skills further to send them as an output to a text file or a CSV file, etc. That can be done as well. But you can also do further filtering here. So I can say hyphen filter, and I want to see all the usernames that start with, let's say, A. Okay. So I'm gonna say starts with, okay, and then close the bracket, type given name, which is the attribute, followed by a comma, and then close the quote here, and then type the name, okay. I'll just say AL. Anybody whose name starts with AL. I will close the bracket and also close the double quote. I'll go ahead and change this because this needs to be double quote and not a single quote. All right, let's run through this and see what happens. So there you go. I've got all the users that start with AL. So that could be Alex and the second Alex created in a different domain and then alpha as well. All right, let's go ahead and run through another lab activity here. Let's go and create a user account in Azure AD with PowerShell. So I'm going to clear this off from here, okay, and start typing the command that will let us create a new user account. So the commandlet is new hyphen Azure AD user. And then you got to type various properties. As you see, there are several properties of the user, like extension property, whether you want account enabled or not, what should be the age group, city, etc. So you can go ahead and start typing in each one of these, but we will go ahead and fill up just the ones that are mandatory for user creation. For example, a password, a display name, a user principal name, etc. Right? Talking about password, it's not recommended that you always pass the passwords in clear text in a script. It's not recommended at all. It's not a good practice. So we create something called as a password profile. Passwords are handled in a special way, and you cannot just pass password like a regular attribute. So this has to go through certain procedures. So what I'm going to do is get rid of this and complete that procedure to store the password and then go to new hyphen Azure AD user commandlet. Okay, so I got to store the password inside an attribute called as, let's say, users password. Okay, and then I'm going to generate a special object which is responsible to manage those password profiles. So the type name would be Microsoft dot open framework in Azure AD, and the model is password profile. Okay, and then I'm gonna pass the password now, that the user's password dot password is anything that you think is complex for the password. So I'm gonna just type something here, let's say delta 98765 exclamation. All right, and now I will use the new hyphen Azure AD user commandlet and then say that the display name of the user object is, let's call him Steve. All right, that's the display name. And now I'm going to use the profile password, or the password profile will be the attribute where the password is stored, which is in line number 2, $users password. Okay. I'm going to also give user principal name because that's a mandatory attribute. So that will be the name at the domain.com or .de. In my case, it is .de. So I'm going to say rainingcloud.de. That will be his user principal name. Similarly, you can add several other attributes like the last name, account enabled, disabled, the geographic location from where the user logs in or not, etc. So I'm going to add, let's say, mail nickname, and the mail nickname will be, let's say, Steve Ford. Okay. So that's the mail nickname. And I will stop for now and execute this line number 1 through 4 all at a time. Okay. There you go. Now it is prompting me for another attribute which says account enabled. You will get this prompt or a pop-up only when it is a mandatory attribute and it has not been declared in the new-Azure AD commandlet. Now because I haven't declared account enabled here, I'm getting that pop-up. So I'm going to say yes here, okay? What is a problem? In the previous lesson, I did specify that when you get error messages, do not panic. The solutions are right there. So let's walk through it and see what the problem is. So here it clearly specifies that the problem is with the mail nickname attribute and there's something wrong going on there. There's a special character between Steve and Ford, so I'm going to get rid of that and then execute it one more time and see what happens. Okay, so there you go. Account enabled. So yes. Now we got a message that Steve at trainingcloud.de is created and is ready. That's how simple it is. So first step is to go ahead and create a password profile, store the password profile inside that variable, and use that variable in the new-Azure AD user commandlet. Okay, let's go back to the user interface and see if that exists or not. Or we can just say get-Azure AD user, and if you'd like, you can use filter as well. But then looks like Steve is right here. I'll go back to the UI and verify this as well. So that's my UI. Go to users and groups, and then in the search box I'll type Steve, and here you go. My user account who is created in Azure Active Directory with the following user principal name is ready. Similarly, you can add users to the groups, assign all these applications, licensing, devices, everything can be done with PowerShell. Let's now talk about Azure Active Directory groups. In Azure Active Directory, you can create two different types of groups: security groups and Office 365 groups. Let's take a look at them one by one. If you would like to create a group account, I'll click on Groups and then click on New Group. You'll land up in a screen that looks like this. So you got two options, a security group and O365 group. The security group is the most common type that is used to manage members, give access to shared resources for a group of users. So by doing it this way, you are granting a set of permissions to the members of that group. So instead of granting permissions user by user, you can grant a permission to this particular security group. The next option is Office 365 group type. In your enterprise, if you got SharePoints, files, calendars, and shared mailboxes, and you would like to provide collaboration opportunities by giving members access to these resources that I just said, then you will use Office 365 groups. This option will let you give people outside of your organization access to the group as well. Both of these groups, security and Office 365, can be managed by admins only. Alright, so I'll select a security group for now, type a group name, call it as, let's say, OneDrive access or something, and then I'll leave the group description as same. Now this is a drop down menu which is grayed out for me because of the kind of subscription I have. But if I have an advanced subscription, I will be able to allow to choose between direct assignment, group assignment, and rule-based assignment. Let's talk about them. A direct assignment is where you assign a user the required access rights by directly assigning a role that has those access rights. Whereas a group assignment is where instead of adding a user, you will be adding a group with the required access rights, and the members of the group will inherit those rights. The last one is very interesting, which is rule-based assignment. Here, the users are added automatically to the group depending on certain validation. There are certain rules to determine a group membership based on users' properties or device properties. So for a user account or a device group membership to be valid, the user or device must meet the rules. Let's talk about this with an example. Let's say the user has an attribute called as manager. We are saying that the user can be part of this group only if the manager is, let's say, Mark. So if the manager is Mark, that's when user becomes a part of this group. Okay, so this is a simple rule which we are using for this demonstration purposes. So we got direct assignment, group assignment, rule-based assignment. Direct assignment is where users are added directly to the group. Group is where you are adding a group to this group, and the members of those group will be inheriting permissions. And the last one is rule-based assignment, where we need to have some kind of a validation to become part of this group. Next is the owner section, where I can have one or more owner as part of this group, and they will be able to manage this group. So if you would like to remove a member from the group, they do not have to contact the help desk or even the administrator. They can do it themselves because they are now owners. And finally, members is where I can add or remove members from this group. Just for demonstration purposes, let me add Alex to this group. So I'll select Alex here. All right. So Alex is part of the OneDrive Access group. Okay. All right, it's ready. So OneDrive Access, and who are the members of this group? Well, just Alex at this time. All right, in corporate environments, always follow group naming convention, right? You need to have some kind of a naming standards. A group naming convention will help you sort and search your tenant groups. There are a few things that I want to specify when we're talking about groups is the settings section. So if you get into the general section here, there are a lot of options to toggle with, right? So there's self-service group management, whether you would like to have this group being self-serviced and self-managed by the group owners, yes or no. Restrict access to groups in the access panel, yes or no. That means when people go to myapps.microsoft.com, on the top right hand side they will see something like group access, right? Do you want this group to be seen by the users is what this option determines. Can the users create security groups themselves? Can the owners who assign members as group owners in the Azure portals, can they do it or not? If yes, you can then go ahead and select a particular owner here. Okay, so I'll select none. Now that was about security groups. Now we have certain controls on Office 365 groups as well. You got the same options as you have for the security groups. All right, then would the groups expire is controlled by expiration, right? So when users can set up their own groups, there will definitely be unused groups and it will multiply over a period of time. So one way to manage those unused groups is to set those groups to expire, and this will reduce the maintenance of manually deleting groups. Expiration policy is simple. Groups with user activities are automatically renewed as expiration nears. That's one part. Another part is group owners also get notified to renew an expiring group. Then a group that is not renewed is deleted. One best part here as part of disaster recovery is that a deleted Office 365 group can be restored within 30 days by the group owner or by an Azure Active Directory administrator. Okay, so that was about expiration. Going to the naming conventions or the naming policy, you can have certain groups blocked and you can define the group naming policy as well. So when somebody creates a group as part of self-service provisioning, they should be following certain prefixes. You can go ahead and select those prefixes and suffixes here to enforce your naming convention and naming policy. And then we just spoke about blocked words where you would not like anybody in your organization to use certain string or certain part of the word in their group name. One thing to keep in mind is that When a new Office 365 group is created, whether it is dynamic or static membership, a welcome notification is sent to all users who are added to the group. When any attribute of a user or the device changes, all dynamic group rules in the organization are processed for potential membership changes. Users who are added then also receive the welcome notification. You can turn this behavior off as well. Alright, that was about groups. So here we learned about how do you create a group, how you can add members to the group, and how you can control the unlimited spanning of the groups because of the self-service provisioning option that we have now. There's an expiration option so that the groups can automatically be cleaned up if they are unused, and then the naming policy where you can enforce the naming convention in your enterprise. In this lab exercise, we'll learn how do you manage groups with PowerShell. To create a group in Azure AD, I gotta type in this command called as new hyphen Azure AD group. I'll use tab completion to fix the cases and then use the display name parameter hyphen display name and call this group as, let's say, app developers. Okay, I can also give it a mail nickname and I will use the same display name as the mail nickname as well. Okay, I'll hit the play button to see what happens. It should connect to the Azure AD in the backend, and looks like my Azure credentials have expired. Okay, so what do I do next? I should run connect hyphen AZ account. So if you notice here, right here in the error message, it does tell us that you gotta run connect hyphen AZ account to have the connection to Azure re-established, right? So let's do that. Okay, I'll quickly type in my credentials. Well, I could use Alex as well, or I'm using my root account this time because both of these are global administrators. Punch in the password quickly. Alright, now I'm connected with this user account. I will now run line number 1. Okay, looks like my group called as app developers is created. So I will now navigate to my Azure portal here and go to groups and see if the app developer group exists. There you go. It's right there. It's a security group and it's assigned. Now you can go ahead and add members to this group by clicking on the add members button. But let's do that with PowerShell, okay? So I'm gonna close this, go back to PowerShell and try to add Alex to this group. The way you do that is by using this command called as add hyphen, I'll move this a little bit down so I can make some space for myself. Just say add hyphen AZ-AD group member, okay? And then say hyphen member user principal name of the member is what? Alex at rainingcloud.de, right? So it's gonna be Alex at rainingcloud.de, close the quotes. Alright? Alright, I'll execute this and see what happens. Now I've got a message here. Parameter cannot be resolved using the specified name parameters. The reason you're getting this error message is because although you are trying to add this user to a group, but you have not specified which group you would like to add this user to. So you need to specify that using the target group display name parameter. Okay. So what is the display name of my group? It is app developer. So I'll just copy and paste that and execute it now. Okay. So that's running. Looks like that's done, right? So I can go back to the interface here, refresh this, and I am able to see Alex in this group, okay? You can also verify this using PowerShell. So let's go back to PowerShell and then just run get hyphen Azure AD group member. And then the display name of the group is app developers, right? So I want to find how many people are in this group. I'll execute that and I should be able to see Alex there. There you go. So it tells me that Alex is part of the group. So as you see, you are able to manage everything. You are able to create users, groups, add users to the groups. And in fact, there are a lot many things that you can do with PowerShell. Not just adding, removing, managing groups, but also changing the expiration policies, setting the naming conventions of the groups, etc.
In this lesson, let's learn and understand about multi-factor authentication. When we use multi-factor authentication, we are using at least two factors of authentication. But what are the factors and how many factors do we have? What you see on the board is the factors of authentication, starting with the first one, which is something you know. The examples of this could be passwords. Anything that is in your memory, right? It could be passwords, it could be your debit card or credit card pins that you do not share it with anybody. Keep it as a secret, right? That's what falls under something you know. The second one is something that you yourself are. Our human body is unique that it itself can be used as a password. And that's where the world of biometrics came into picture. Biometrics is the measurement of our biological traits. It could be fingerprint, eye scan, retina scan, or even facial recognition. These are examples of something you are. The third one is something that you have. Traditionally, we used to use devices like RSA tokens, where you had the number ticking on it every 30 seconds, and you would use that number as a password. So there's an algorithm running behind the scenes. In today's world, to reduce the complexity, we've started using soft tokens which could be deployed on your phone. You can install any authenticator, and there are different kinds of authenticators available in today's world. So you can go to your app store, search for Facebook Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, or even Google Authenticator. And when you do that, you will have the numbers ticking on it. You have to synchronize those numbers with your application, and then you will be able to use that number as a second factor of authentication. These are the three primary factors of authentication. Although there are others as well. For example, somewhere you are, as based on your geographical location, you may get authenticated or your access may be denied. That's a fourth factor, but that's not used and it's not that much prominent. The ones that you see on the board have been implemented and tested. With Microsoft Azure, you can use something you know, which is the passwords, and the last one, which is something you have with the help of Microsoft Authenticator or even with any other authenticator app you may have on your phone. We need this kind of integration done to secure your applications against unauthorized access. This is done to make sure that even if the attackers have the first point, which is something you know, if they have compromised credentials in their database, even then they will not be able to access the application because they do not have the second factor of authentication. So their efforts to hack and compromise your credentials will be absolutely futile because we have done our due diligence in integrating the second factor of authentication.
So how do you set up multi-factor authentication for the users? Let's go ahead and set it up for our user called as Alex. To do so, I will navigate to the user section, and what you'll notice is MFA, the multi-factor authentication, right here on the top. So I'll click on that, and you'll notice that it takes me to a totally different tab. Here I gotta log in as an admin, and then you'll get into the dashboard of multi-factor authentication. So here you can go ahead and enable and disable MFA for users individually. Now looking at the user Alex, I'll check this box, and then on the right hand side I'll click on enable to enable multi-factor authentication for the user. Okay, so that's done. That's how simple it is. Now let's go ahead and try to log in as Alex and see if Alex is enforced to do MFA. Okay, so I'm going to launch the incognito mode so that I do not use any cookies, and I will navigate to myapps.microsoft.com. Okay, this time I will log in as Alex because Alex is the only guy who's got MFA enabled. You'll log in with alex at rainingcloud.de. Alright, he then types in his password. And now, because Alex is logging in for the first time after the MFA setup, he's prompted to keep his account secure. Let's do that now. I'll click on next. And now Alex will be prompted to either set up an authentication phone or an office phone or a mobile app, right? So the difference between the authentication phone and office phone is that when you select authentication phone, you will be given access to type your own phone number. Whereas if you go ahead and type office phone, this is an attribute which the MFA is picking up from Active Directory. Let me show that to you. So I'll minimize this, go back to Azure Active Directory, go to Alex, and then here there's an option to set up the mobile phone, right? So whatever number is set here, this is where the message, code, or the phone will ring when MFA is triggered, right? So that's what mobile phone or office phone means. On the other side, Alex can also choose to have authentication done on his own personal device. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and fill these fields up and quickly show you that. So I'm going to type in my number. Okay. And I will select send me a code by text. That's fine. There you go. So I got a text message which I'm going to punch in here and then click on verify. So that is all. Now next time when Alex tries to log in, he will be sent a code on his phone and he then has to type that code to log in. So apart from typing in his credentials, he has to verify with the code as well. Okay. So what I'm going to do is sign Alex out from here and sign in again. So I will launch the incognito mode one more time. Go to same website, myapps.microsoft.com, log in with Alex. So that's one factor of authentication. So password is one factor. The second factor is the text. So someone who has hacked my password must also steal my phone to get the authentication done and to access my applications, right? So this is what multi-factor authentication is. I'll go back to the admin portal here. In the admin portal, you can also run a bulk update, search for the users. So if you want to search for a particular user, let's say Matt, you will be able to find it right here. So this is a search option. There's not much of complexity here. You can filter them by enabled or enforced, run a bulk update, and then view who the global admins are, password admins are, and service administrator. So this is not a complex screen. There's not much of an options here. Usually you'll just go ahead and select the user and enable or disable the MFA. We'll talk more about authentication methods. So if I navigate to Alex profile and click on authentication methods, here are certain options we have, and we will talk about it in the next lesson. As we saw in the previous lab activity that there were different authentication methods that were presented to Alex. So as a user, Alex can choose a call to phone, where an automated voice just calls the person, the user answers the call, and then presses the hash button on the keyboard to authenticate. The next option which we selected is text message to phone. This is where a text message will be sent that contains a verification code. The user is prompted to enter the verification code into the sign-in interface. This process is also called as one-way SMS. The next option is notification through a mobile app, where a push notification on the phone on the registered device is sent, and the user views the notification and selects approve to complete the verification. So there's a Microsoft Authenticator app available for your Windows Phone, Android, as well as for iOS. So push notifications through mobile app provides the best user experience. And there's another option which is verification code from the mobile app. The same Authenticator app generates a new OAuth verification code every 30 seconds. The user then has to enter the verification code into the sign-in interface. Keep in mind that if you have no cellular connectivity, there is no internet, you can still use this method because the verification code on the mobile app works on algorithm and not based on the internet. So user has an array of options to choose from as far as the authentication methods are concerned. So when user like Alex selects a particular authentication mode, that is updated here in this interface. So as an admin, you will be able to see what authentication method Alex has selected. But you may be thinking, what if Alex loses his device or loses his mobile phone, maybe lost it under the couch or something? Then what do you do? Well, when Alex calls the help desk, what help desk can do is just go ahead and click on this option which is require re-register MFA. So when Alex tries to log in, he can change the authentication method. So then Alex will change it to a new number or change it to a push notification. It all depends on what you want to do. But this little button here which says require re-register MFA will enforce Alex to go ahead and re-register the MFA with the new authentication option. Okay. Alternatively, if the end user has a lot of problem navigating to the interface and setting up their own MFA, then you can type in or punch in the phone numbers manually or email address manually here, and this is just for additional user assistance.
In Azure Active Directory, we can have three kinds of user accounts. One is an identity that is created directly on the Azure portal. In the previous lessons, in the lab activities, we created a user account called as Alex at rainingcloud.de, right? So such accounts are cloud native user accounts, and they are also called as cloud identities. They are native to the cloud. They were not synchronized from your on-premise to Azure Active Directory. Well, such accounts will then be called as directory sync identities. So any account that is created natively in Azure is called as cloud identity, but accounts that are synchronized from on-prem to Azure Active Directory are called as directory sync identities. Okay, so there is a third account as well. There are situations where you work with externals or contractors or third-party companies, and you would like to grant permissions to them so that they can manage your virtual machines, let's say, or your databases in Azure. In that case, you will invite them as guests to your directory. The external accounts can continue to use their email addresses to access our resources. So we do not have to create their accounts in Azure AD or on our premise. We can invite their account as guests to our Azure AD so that they can continue to use their identities to access our resources. To summarize, we got three kinds of user accounts. The account that is created directly in Azure is called as cloud identity. The account that gets synchronized from on-premise to Azure Active Directory is called as directory sync identities, whereas external accounts or third parties or anybody who's not part of our infrastructure, when they are invited, they are called as guests. When you're doing the labs, try inviting your Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo account and see how that works, how you can grant permissions to external accounts and they can have the same level of access and permissions that usually internal Azure accounts and synced accounts have. When you're designing solutions for Azure Active Directory, it helps to know different capabilities that we have as far as self-services are concerned. This will help us minimize the burden on the staff, and we are also empowering our users to safely and securely perform a range of tasks. We're talking about three main self-service capabilities of Azure AD: the self-service group management, the self-service application access, and self-service password reset. Let's go through them one by one. So when you click on groups and then click on general here, you will see four options here, and these are important to understand for self-service group management. First one is if the owners can manage group membership requests in the access panel. Now, what is an access panel? When users try to access applications, they navigate to myapps.microsoft.com to access the applications that have been assigned to them. So you can toggle between yes and no to give them options to manage their own group, so they can then add themselves to a group or remove themselves from the group. Well, this time it is grayed out for me. It just clearly tells me that I'm not using the right subscription. I just hover the mouse over this information icon. It tells me that this feature requires Azure Active Directory Premium, at least P1, P2 better, but P1 will still work. Now the next option is restrict access to groups in the access panel. Now if you have this on, that means the users will not be able to see the group in their access panel. But this will not affect the administrators. Administrators will still be able to manage the groups from their access panels. What do we have next here? Users can create groups in the Azure portal. Well, this tells me that users can not only add or remove themselves from the group, but also create their own security groups. And finally, owners who can assign members as group owners in the Azure portal. Now, who will be allowed to assign members is something that you can decide here. By default, it's set to all, but you can have a set of people or set of employees managing it, or just say none. In that case, nobody will be able to assign members as group owners. Now, these four options will take care of the self-service group management. The last one here is the Office 365 groups. This is for self-service of any Office 365 groups. Remember, when you're creating a group, you got two options, one for security group and the second one was for Office 365. Now that's what we got here, self-service management for security groups and Office 365 groups. It's also important to understand the naming policy. Let's go through this. So when your staff creates a group, do you want them to adhere to a specific naming convention? Should there be a prefix? Should there be a suffix? Is something that you can control from here. Also, you may want to block certain words, certain restricted words that you have already used in the organization. You can upload your own CSV or even download the CSV of blocked words. Now, this is about self-service management of your Azure AD groups. Self-service provides the staff the ability to manage their own groups through My Apps portal. Let's look at the second self-service option, which is the application access. I'll go to the enterprise applications here and then click on user settings. One of the options of our interest is the second one, which is users can add gallery apps to their access panel. This tells us whether or not the users can have and access the applications in our directory. So you can toggle between yes and no here. If you say yes, that means that users can then search for the applications in our directory and then start accessing them. By default, this option is set to no. Another option that you will notice under the enterprise application section is whether you want a user to access a particular application or not. For example, you want to control this application very granularly. So you want to disable self-service for this particular app. Now the option is right here. Allow users to request access to this application. By default, this is set to no, but if you say yes, you can then select a particular group that can request access to this application. So although at the top level right here, you are controlling whether the users can add gallery apps to their access panel or not, by saying yes, you are letting this permission inherit to all the applications. But then you can go back to a particular application and then control it at a very granular level and say that I want to override that particular setting. So by having this setting to off, allow users to request access to this application. If I set it to yes, users will be able to access the application. If I set no, then users cannot request access to this application. This is the second self-service option, which is self-service of enterprise applications. The last self-service option is the password reset. So if I scroll down to the bottom and then look at the password reset option, you will be able to enable self-service password reset for your staff. And that means that you are allowing your users to manage your password from your phone or from any device that's been assigned to them. They can also do it from any location and just make sure that they are compliant to the security policies. So they can reset their passwords. They do not have to remember their old password, but they can still do the self-service password. This works great if you have multi-factor authentication enabled as well. That way you'll be having another layer of defense. In this lesson, we learned about three main self-service capabilities of Azure Active Directory: the self-service group management and self-service application access, and finally self-service password reset.
Azure Active Directory licensing. Do we really need to know about it? We absolutely do. As a solutions architect, you need to know what you need to pay for and what is it that you get for free. The business people and the stakeholders whom you'll be speaking with will really ask these questions. Do I really have to pay for all the rich features of Azure Active Directory and the security features like multi-factor authentication, conditional access, privilege identity management, or identity protection? I would encourage you to get familiar with the items that are listed here in this document. So let's say you're speaking with a company that is already using Azure AD and now wants to protect their identities. Then what type of license would they need? Maybe they need conditional access but do not need risk-based conditional access. In this case, they can just work with P1 license. How about a scenario where they need to prevent against risk events or they would like to use PIM, then they would need P2 licenses. Please take a look at this Microsoft article, and in this article, you would need to look at these headings and then map them against these columns. Everything that is checked under the free category will be available for free and you do not need any license. But anything that is not checked, for example, group access management or self-service password research for cloud users, is available in Office 365 apps, P1 and P2. So you can start mapping these headers against the categories or against the licensing models. So this is a quick lesson on licenses, but make sure that you get familiar with the licenses and understand what falls under the free section and what falls under the Office 365 apps, P1 and P2 licensing models. In this lesson, let's go ahead and learn about Azure AD domain join. Traditionally, on your premise, when you had domain controllers, you could easily join your Windows 10 and Windows 7 and 8 devices to the domain. With that, you got several advanced features, for example, single sign on, enterprise control and security on all your devices, and you can restrict your devices as well. In Azure AD, although it is in the cloud, you can still join your devices to your cloud-based Active Directory or Azure AD. You can let your employees bring their own devices and allow them to single sign on using the devices that they own or even corporate devices. This will empower your users to be productive wherever and whenever they want. At the same time, IT administrators must ensure that these assets are protected and devices must meet certain security and compliance requirements as well. Let's talk about the Azure AD domain join benefits. With the advent of cloud, today we got lots of applications as software as a service applications and services. When you join your device to Azure AD, you get the benefit of single sign-on. Your users will not have to do any additional authentication prompts when accessing the work resources. So the SSO functionality is available even when users are not connected to the domain network. You also get enterprise compliant roaming of user settings across the joined devices. Users do not need to connect to a Microsoft account like a Hotmail account or something. They can continue to use their corporate email account, and those settings will be propagating to all the devices. You will get access to the Windows Store for Business when you use your Azure AD account. Your users can choose from a range of applications that are pre-selected by your organization. There's a Windows Hello support for secure and convenient access to work resources. You can have restriction of access to applications from only devices that meet compliance policies. Not just cloud, you can also have seamless access to your on-premise resources when the device has a line of sight to the on-premise domain controller. So it's just not about cloud-based applications, but also on-premise applications. What's important to understand is also the connection options we have to connect to Azure AD. How can you connect to Azure AD? So there are two options. One is registering the device, second is joining the device. Registering a device to Azure AD enables you to manage a device's identity. That means when a device is registered, Azure AD device registration provides the device with an identity that is then used to authenticate it every time a user signs in to Azure AD. The second one is joining a device. Joining a device is an extension to registering a device. That means that it provides you with all the benefits of registering a device, and in addition to that, you can change the local state of the device. Changing the local state enables your users to sign into the device using an organization account, work account, or school account instead of a personal account. Enterprises usually combine this registration with an MDM solution such as Microsoft Intune.
Now, MDM is Mobile Device Management Solution, and organizations that have corporate enterprise agreements with Microsoft, they will onboard Microsoft Intune to their enterprise to manage all such devices. Now, what does that mean? It means that you are bringing lots of security and compliance into your organization with the help of integration capabilities with Azure AD Domain Join and MDM solutions.
The focus of this lesson is to understand AD Connect. Let's understand that with the help of certain diagrams. Let's say on your premise you got something like a domain. Let's call that domain as rainingcloud.de. So this rainingcloud.de is like a fictitious company. Let's also assume that it has certain domain controllers. So this is our server which has Active Directory installed on it. So this will be your domain controller. On the domain controller, you got several user objects, right? And they may be in different departments. Let's call them as, let's say, Mark, Joe, Mary, etc. And there will be thousands of other users working in different departments in different geographies. Okay. Now, with the advent of cloud, your company has started adopting certain applications in software as a service side of business. So that's where you thought that you will go ahead and utilize the features of Azure Active Directory. Okay, so this directory is in the cloud. So you have decided to take benefit of Azure Active Directory so that you can onboard SaaS-based applications like Workday, Concur, Salesforce, and Office 365 for mailing purposes. All right. That also means that you want to synchronize your identities from on-premise Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. Gone are the days when we used to think that on-premise is secure. Everything which is inside your boundaries is secure and everything outside the boundary is not secure, which is on the internet. Well, we are now moving on to an advanced world with advanced set of tools as well that gives us furthermore identities into the transactions that happen between the identities and the SaaS-based applications. But taking a step back and talking about Azure Active Directory Connect, the objective is to synchronize these identities, identity 1, 2, and 3, to Azure Active Directory so that these identities can then access the SaaS-based applications. So what you're going to do is install another member server, provision that member server, and install AD Connect right here. Okay, so I'm going to call it as, let's say, AD Connect server or something, right? So that's my AD Connect member server. Of course, you got to configure that AD Connect so that it can go and look into the user objects in your domain controller, in your domain, and then synchronize that to Azure Active Directory, right? So the AD Connect tool must have permissions to go and connect to the on-prem DC as well as Azure Active Directory. So you must be a global admin to do that synchronization, okay? So once everything is set up, you will be able to do a synchronization between the identities. Okay, remember that this synchronization is not two-way synchronization, it's just one way. So when users are created on your premise, they get synchronized to Azure AD and not vice versa. Well, there is an option to synchronize passwords from cloud to on-premise. It's called as password write back, but you need to enable that when you are installing the AD Connect tool. Okay, without that, the password does not get synchronized from Azure to on-prem. By default, the password hashes do get synchronized from on-prem to Azure AD, but not vice versa. Okay, so just to summarize, what is the AD Connect? It's a tool that will let you synchronize your on-prem identities to Azure Active Directory. This synchronization happens at an interval of 30 minutes by default. However, you can get into the tool and change that behavior, but by default it is 30 minutes. You can also use PowerShell to push that synchronization. So let's say you got an object created in Active Directory and you want to sync the object right now, then you can run that PowerShell command or launch the AD Connect tool to run that manual synchronization. But by default, it is 30 minutes. On the Azure side, you will see when the synchronization happened. So you can launch the Azure Active Directory portal, and then you will be able to see when the synchronization last happened or last occurred. Is the Active Directory Connect healthy or not? Are there any user objects that are not synchronized? So out of 10,000 objects, 5 objects had certain attribute related issues, and they are not able to synchronize themselves to Azure Active Directory. That's AD Connect Health. And you will be able to see that on the Azure portal. As an Azure admin, you are responsible for AD Connect, synchronization of user objects, and also identifying the health status of the AD Connect tool. So you log into Azure portal and check that health status every time and again. But it is always a best practice to go ahead and get notified if there are any issues. So every time an issue is identified, a notification is then triggered and emailed to you. AD Connect is a very important tool to let that synchronization happen from on-prem Active Directory to the cloud-based directory services with Microsoft called as Azure AD.
Let's quickly talk about Azure AD Connect Health and how it is important. Azure AD Connect is really important for hybrid identities. That makes monitoring of this service so critical. Azure AD Health Connect tells us whether the sync has happened and if there are any sync errors. So what we are monitoring is the synchronization of objects from on-premise directory to Azure AD. To see the Azure AD Connect Health, we need to go into Active Directory. I'll just collapse this and then we go back to Azure AD Connect. And then this is the place where you can see whether the sync has happened. If yes, when. Is the password hash also been synchronized? Are you using federation? Well, this is a lot of read-only information. But if you want to see the logs, the health, then you need to identify the health and analytics section. Let's click on Azure AD Connect Health. Now here you can find more about the synchronization errors. There's a sync that happens between on-premise Active Directory to Azure Active Directory, and we need to know things like, are there any synchronization issues? Are there any duplicate attributes? So we need to fix them, and in order to fix them, we need to know them first. So we can configure the notifications as well, because it's not always ideal for an engineer to come here and then look at the errors. So we usually go ahead and set up notifications and put additional email addresses. Usually all global administrators are notified by default, but you can have additional email addresses set up. Let's take a look at a few more options here. We can identify the sync services and also for additional services like ADFS. One thing to keep in mind is that for us to use Azure AD Connect Health, we need to have Azure AD Premium license. For the first agent that we install, we need one license. But in addition, if you want to install few more agents, then we need to buy at least 25 licenses. So 25 licenses is the bare minimum that we need to start with. So let's say you need to install 2 licenses. That means you need to buy the first one and then 25 others. So that will be 26 in total. If you got underlying infrastructure like domain controllers in your environment, you can identify their sync status and also replication issues by just clicking on this ADDS option. By now, you know that there is an Azure Active Directory Connect agent that gets installed on the domain controllers or on the federation services. Microsoft does development innovations all the time and they update the agent version to the next one. Do you want that agent version to be updated on your Windows machines as well? If yes, then you can select the auto update on or off. Look at this option here. It says use auto update to automatically update your installed Azure AD Connect Health agent to the latest version. So if you want this agent to be updated automatically, we set it to on. Please be mindful that a lot of organizations do not want this to happen, so they set it to off. So with Azure AD Connect Health, we are monitoring the underlying infrastructure like ADFS or ADDS. And then the Azure AD Connect really helps to identify any synchronization issues between the on-premise directory services and Azure directory services.
Let's talk about Azure Active Directory B2B and how it supports your organization and its ability to collaborate with other organizations. So what is B2B? Now, B2B is a simplified and streamlined process for us to connect to Azure AD environment with external environments. So you can now invite clients or partners and grant them access to resources within our environment. For example, let's say if you create an application like we did earlier in the previous lesson, and now you want to invite your client to access your application. Or let's say if you want to start doing certain work with them or maybe share workloads with external partners. So you need to give some kind of identity. Traditionally, you would create a new user account and grant them a password to the partner and let them access your application. But with B2B, you will have an additional layer of security and then you would create a federated identity. With this way, you can grant partners access to your resources. Azure AD is a streamlined way of achieving this. You can invite the external users as a guest to your internal Active Directory. You can also configure a custom welcome message including the terms of use. So external users need to sign the terms and accept your terms before they start using your resources. The advantage is that these invited accounts will also need to follow the security procedures that internal users follow. That means you're adding additional layer of protection such as multi-factor authentication and conditional access. Let's go through the process of inviting a new guest user. The process of inviting a new guest user remains the same. So I can just click on the new guest user button here and then make sure that the invite user radio button is selected. Then you can type the name of your partner and the email address of the partner. And that's all. You're ready to invite the account. Let's do that. Now let's say you want to invite Rob and Rob's email address is rob@company.com. The first name is Rob and say Evans. You can also put a custom personal message here. Hi Rob, let's get connected to the apps. Alright, so you can grant access through groups, assign role-based permissions, grant roles, and there are certain other features that were there for a regular user account. And then you click on invite. Within few minutes, Rob should get an email with this custom message, and Rob then has to click on the hyperlink, accept the terms of usage, and Rob will then be part of the Active Directory environment in the cloud. You can search for the user just like the way you searched for an internal user, and there you go, you got Rob right here. But this is an invited user. You can resend the invitation because the invitation is not accepted, right? Now the attributes that you see here on the left hand side are the same as the ones that we see for a user. So you can now start assigning them roles, groups, and then access to applications as well. So we are treating an external account or a partner's account just like the way we treat Azure Active Directory account. So there is a relation between your tenant and the external partner that is created, and Microsoft manages that. There is a relationship that gets created between your tenant and the email address where the invitation was sent. You can look at these relationships by going into this organization relationships section, and you will be able to see all the users that were invited. Looks like Rob has not accepted the invitation and hence we do not see in the list. But any external account would then be visible in this section under organization relationships. So Azure AD B2B is a fully online federation services, so you do not have to run your on-premise ADFS environment. Azure B2B will let you invite your guest users, partners, or external people whom you want to work with, grant access to them to your applications, and also resources within the organization. On top of it, you get the security suite just like the way the internal users get. They will have the multi-factor authentication and conditional access. Azure Active Directory B2C, or business to consumer. Let's talk about the purpose of B2C and how you can configure Azure AD B2C. This is a unique Azure AD tenant that you can provision yourself if you want to use an identity source for your own applications that you are building. Azure AD B2C is a function of Azure AD that is targeted towards developers. If you really like the features in Azure AD and you do not want to configure all these features that Azure AD has, and you're really interested in using these features within your applications, then Azure B2C is something that you might be interested in. For example, you might want to manage identities for your application that you're developing. Let's say you are developing a gaming application and users must be able to access this via web and also with mobile. The identities must be in a centralized place and you want to manage them to make things easier for your users. You also want to let them sign in with the existing identities like Facebook or Amazon or Google identity. This is a common feature in the industry to let users sign in with identities. This is what Azure B2C lets you do. As a developer, you can create your own Azure AD tenant and configure a range of identity providers that are supported. So when your users actually sign into your app, they can go through a sign-in process and use any of the supported identity providers. You can manage all the identities even though they use their own personally preferred identity provider. Let's go ahead and see how this is possible. To create an Azure B2C tenant, I'll click on Create a Resource and then type B2C in the Marketplace search box. Then click on Azure AD B2C and then just click on Create. Now you have two options, which is creating a new Azure AD B2C tenant, and the second one is linking an existing Azure AD B2C tenant to my Azure subscription. We will circle around this option in a minute, but let's go ahead and create a new Azure AD B2C tenant now. You can type the organization name as the Great Game Office and then type greatgames.onmicrosoft.com. You will see that the name here is something similar to that we have for our actual tenant ending with .onmicrosoft.com. So if I hover my mouse on my email address here, I will see the tenant name or the domain name, which is my email address without any special characters .onmicrosoft.com. Looks like this is already selected. So I'll put my mouse on this red exclamation and see the message. It says already in use by another directory. Let's type something else here. Best games. Let's see if it's there. Looks like no. I'll type Game of Horns. Let's see. Looks like that is there. I'll leave the region as United States, but you have the options to select any region that you want. And then just click on Create. It takes a while to get this directory created, so I'll pause the video and get connected once again once it is ready. So it looks like that is ready. I'll go ahead and click on this little hyperlink which says click here to manage your new directory. Notice that is opening a new tab, and this is connecting to my new B2C tenant. It says we are preparing your B2C. That means it's still not active, although you can look at the options here. At this point, you got a warning that no subscription is linked to the B2C tenant or a subscription needs attention. So let's go ahead and see how you can link this B2C tenant with your subscription. To do so, I'll go back to Create a Resource section and then type B2C here. Then click on it and then finally click on Create again. Now if you remember, we were on this screen a few minutes ago. The second option here will let me link my B2C tenant to my Azure subscription. Click on that, and then in this drop-down menu, I should be able to see my tenant. Let's see. There you go. I've got Game of Horns on Microsoft.com right here. You can select your subscription and select the resource group. Well, let's go ahead and create a new one and say lab. Say OK, and then put that in a particular resource group location. Just say East US. Alright, finally click on Create. By doing this, we have now linked the Azure B2C tenant to my subscription. While the deployment is still in progress, I'll just go and type B2C here, and then go to my tenant. Looks like the B2C tenant is linked up to my subscription. Let's go and click on Go to Resource, and we should be able to see all the features of our new tenant here. So this Azure B2C tenant right here is different and separate from your actual Azure AD tenant. Now if I put my mouse again on the email address, you will see that the tenant name is something else and the tenant that we created for B2C is different from our actual tenant. So you may ask, why do I need two tenants here? Why not use the actual tenant instead of a B2C tenant? Well, the Azure AD tenant is used for, I would say, internal usage for your internal users and with the partners for whom you want to work with. But if you have applications that is being built and you need to market that to external users and the external users belong to external world and you would like to have a fully isolated tenant, for that purpose, you would need a B2C. Let's see how you can register the application that you're building with this tenant. I'll click on the B2C tenant settings at this time. And then you will notice that there's an application section just like the way you have it in Azure AD, and then click on add to add your applications. So if you click on this add button, you will be able to type a name of your application and whether you would like to include a web app, yes or no, and then typing the URL of your app and then typing a random app ID URL for making it unique app ID. Well, you have another option here which is called as identity providers. So you can have the range of identity providers like Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Amazon. Another important section is the user flow. User flows are to do with how the users sign in. What kind of experience do you want to give to your users? What page should they see when they log in? How will they reset their passwords? So these are workflows that we would like to provide to the users. I'll click on the new user flow here to look at the options I have inside user flow. There you go. You can set up how a user experience should be to sign up and sign in, how their profiles and what kind of data or attributes you would like to store, and how the passwords are verified and reset. So Azure B2C is targeted towards developers, like I said earlier, and these developers are building applications for market. Azure AD B2C is used to create a separate, isolated environment for managing your identities. But if you'd like to provide applications for the internal users, then you can continue to use Azure AD and you do not need Azure B2C.
Monitoring Azure Active Directory. In this video, we'll take a look at monitoring Active Directory and specific approaches and things that we should bear in mind as a solutions architect when we're talking about PIM, Privileged Identity Management, and Azure Identity Protection. Let's talk about Azure AD monitoring. Monitoring is really important activity to do. We also know that in the modern identity-centric world, we need to ensure that we are regularly monitoring the behaviors and patterns of our identities. So as far as monitoring is concerned, we get different kinds of reports. There are security reports, activity reports, and then reports from Azure Monitor. We spoke about this in the Azure Identity Protection section, where we can identify risky users, risky sign-ons, etc. So even if you're not using premium licenses, you can still get some sort of information from this section. So if I scroll down to the bottom a little bit and then click on security and then click on risky users and risky sign-ins under report, this is where you'll get that information from. Similar to risky users, you can also get the risky sign-in logs. So we are looking at proactive form of identification of risk here. We are measuring the risk level at the time actual sign-in takes place. We can then either block the user or allow them after the multi-factor authentication is correctly authenticated. Again, higher the licenses, more details you'll get about the risk. The users that are flagged as risky is something that you will see in the risky users section. Azure AD Identity Protection comes with P2 licenses. This also means that you will get lots of information with P2 license. So with P1 license, you may get very basic information about the risk, but with P2 licenses, you'll get a lot more information like the user's geographical location, the device they are using, the Active Directory location attribute, multi-factor authentication details, etc. Another report that you can see in Azure AD is the activity reports. Another report that we can see in Azure AD is the activity reports. This is under the monitoring section, and you can see it in the form of sign-ins, audit logs, and usage and insights. Let's take a look at audit logs. You will be able to see this information regardless of the licenses you have. This tells us what sort of actions have occurred in my tenant. This is more like a trace and tells us about all the interactions that have happened with your tenant. Another monitoring log is the sign-ins log. This tells us information about all the sign-ins that have occurred in our enterprise applications. So we get information about the usage patterns. Have the users satisfied conditional access from where they are signing in? What resources are they accessing when they are signing in? What applications are they accessing, etc. This feature really needs Azure Active Directory premium licenses, and that means that it is not available for the free version of Azure AD. Another important place is usage and insights. So this is where you can get the reports about the usage of your applications, activities of your federated applications, and any activities related to authentications. This also needs a premium license. With the last option here, which is authentication method activity, you will be able to see the users that are registered for MFA, users registered for self-service password reset, users who have registered and enabled for SSPR, and users who can reset their own passwords. So these are certain patterns and numbers that you can see when you push MFA and SSPR across your enterprise. At times, you may want to integrate this piece of monitoring with a third-party solution or route these logs to a log analytics. That's something that you can do in the log section. So if you have integrated Azure AD monitoring with log analytics, well, you will be able to use the query feature of log analytics and get more information and insights out of it. We do not need a premium license for this. All we gotta do is enable log analytics for our tenant. In the diagnostic settings, we would be able to add a diagnostic setting and choose to either archive to a storage account, stream to an event hub, or send to log analytics. By default, if you're not using premium licenses, then your data, which is specifically the audit logs, is stored only for 7 days. And sometimes this is very less when you want to investigate with things and want to find out what has happened in your environment. You may want to archive to a storage account, probably archive the audit logs and archive the sign-in logs as well. In that case, you can move the slider left to right, and 0 means unlimited, and maximum number that you can get is 365 days. If you have Azure AD premium licenses, then you can store the data for 30 days by default. So if you're sending information to log analytics, you can capitalize on the log analytics queries and run certain deep queries on the sign-ins as well as on the audit logs. So in this lesson, we learned about monitoring Azure Active Directory, the options we have, and where in Azure Active Directory tenant we should go and look at security reports, activity reports, and the reports from Azure Monitor.